1 Samuel chapter 18. Can you guys believe we're 18 chapters in? It gets difficult teaching through different sections of the Bible and different chapters. This chapter is particularly difficult because a lot happens very quickly. It gives a very quick synopsis of this, then that, then this, then that. And really what it's contrasting is the two relationships between Saul and David. As we move through this, we'll go through and read it once in its entirety, and then we're going to section it off and we're going to look at Saul and his pride, and then David and his humility in that contrast. The narrator who wrote this down for us, inspired by God, did it in such a way that you really start to get frustrated with Saul and you really start to identify with David. This young man who is just successful, he's brilliant, he's wise, he's charismatic. People really like him. They take a liking to him, particularly after slaying Goliath. When we start seeing that contrast, you start to identify these things are bad, I don't want to be like this, and these things are good, I want to be like that. So as we read this text, we're going to chop it up into pieces. It might be a little difficult to follow. But the goal is to understand section verse 1 through 3 in its own context, and then we're going to get verses 6 through 30 in its own context. And while we do 6 through 30, really the whole chapter, verse 18, we will focus, okay, let's talk about Saul. Okay, let's talk about David. And then we'll talk about application at the end. So let's read 18 verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry at this saying, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertaking, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fear and awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I, and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should be given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Mehethalathite, for a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul. The thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law." And Saul's servants spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" And the servants of Saul told him, "Thus and so did David speak." Then Saul said, "Thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servant told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. Amen and amen. I think that's sufficient. We don't need any more, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. First slide, we're going to talk about being a BFFFF. So verses 1 through 5 talks about Jonathan and David. David kills Goliath. He is brought back Goliath's head in his hands and his armor, and he carries it to Saul, and then he has a conversation with Saul. Saul does not let him return home, but this is our official introduction to Jonathan and David's relationship. What does it say about Jonathan and David? They are BFFs. Why? Who initiated this relationship? It's interesting to note. So first of all, a lot of people take this text and they twist it. They twist it against the scripture itself, and they say that Jonathan and David had a homosexual relationship and yada, yada, yada. I'm not even going to get into that because it's so nonsensical. But what's interesting here is that the love that Jonathan has for David is instant, it's immediate, and it is committed. He loves David as what? Himself, which is the great commandment. This is what Jesus says. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. If you would fulfill the law, do this. Love others, treat others as you would treat yourself. We found in the past that Jonathan is a righteous man. Jonathan is used of God. Jonathan is committed to the cause of God. Jonathan is a man who loves God. So when he is introduced to another man who loves God, he instantly has a connection because he has the Spirit of God and David has the Spirit of God. They instantly are best friends. And Jonathan goes out of his way to make a covenant. They have one soul, they have one spirit because of one Lord, and then now they have a friendship covenant. This covenant is a promissory covenant saying, I will always look after you, and you will always look after me, and our children forever and ever. Our families will be bonded together to care for one another. This is a very important covenant of friendship. This means that should somebody move away, if they were traveling, they could stop in and gather supplies and find refreshment, security, and protection on their journey. This is a very common thing, but it is a very serious thing that the commitment that they're taking is lifelong and it is above other relationships. What we're going to find is that Jonathan will pick David over his own family. That's the level of this friendship covenant. It is BFFs forever. It is legitimate best friends forever. We get into the robe, the armor, the bow, the sword, the belt. As Brooke said, what this represents is the position, the protection, and the prophecy. Where did David come from? Tell me his story in the past 24 hours. What would he be dressed like? What would he look like? Came out of the field. What was he doing? He was going to give food to his brothers. So if we backtrack, if we rewind, like a classic A-track, we would go back to Goliath, from Goliath to his father, from his father to the field with the sheep. So he would be dressed like a shepherd. He'd be dirty, he'd be grimy, he'd be stinky. Not a lot of showering would be going on. He gets called out of the field. He goes to his father, and his father says, go and take refreshments to your brothers and to the commanders. He gets there, he sees Goliath, he is incited to respond. He defeats Goliath, but he is dressed as a shepherd. He is a servant. He is a very low-level human beings in this society. Shepherds are the lowest and the least of this society. They're like trash collectors in our day and age. It's actually a pretty honorable job nowadays, but back in the day, if you collected trash, you were trash, right? Those stinky people over there. What Jonathan is doing is he is elevating him. Jonathan is taking off royal dress wear and giving it to him. And then he is giving him something that almost nobody has. I'm sure as years has gone by, people gathered weapons as they did war and stuff like that. But you had to be an elite soldier to have a sword, a bow, a shield, armor. You were at the top of the class. So what he does is he elevates him to be a superior person in this society. And then he honors him with his very own equipment. He doesn't just give him a sword, he gives him his sword. He doesn't just give him a bow, he gives him his bow. This is the prince's bow. Jonathan would be heir to the throne. And then this is a prophecy because David was anointed king. Nobody knew, nobody understood, but David was anointed. God was calling him to be the king, and the prince had given him everything to the throne. That's the picture, that David has been called to the throne and given the apparel and the tools, the authority, and the stature of the king in the making. Now, a point of interest, and we've talked about this, especially in Proverbs, where it says, show yourself to be friendly and you'll have many friends. David is who we admire. We want to be like David. We want to be conquerors. We want to be victorious. We want to be successful. We want to be wise. We want to be impactful. We want to change the world. We want to be people after God's heart. You look at David and you want to be like David. Well, David has a best friend. David has Jonathan. Jonathan is a very special gift that God gave him. And that is a gift to be received. We want to be like David, and we want a Jonathan. We want a friend who can be there in season and out of season, in our days of success, in our days of trouble. Jonathan is faithful through and through. So we want to be like David and receive a Jonathan. And also, we want to be like Jonathan and find a David. We want to be a friend. We want to be a faithful servant to serve somebody around us. We want to be that person who can commit themselves to the greater good of somebody else. Somebody who is successful, somebody who is leading and breaking through the ranks, somebody that you admire, somebody that you want to encourage and build up and lead on that path when they have troubles and they have difficulty. You want to be able to support them and encourage them. I find this to be very insightful to our pastors, with our leaders and our Bible study people and people who lead us spiritually, coming alongside of them while they're in the battle, while they're in ministry, when they're suffering and they're dealing with certain family issues, being very encouraging and building them up and helping them in their times of need. Because what we're going to find is David is one of the most loneliest people in the Bible. David has everything, but he loses everything. David rises to the top and gets thrown off the cliff and falls to the bottom consistently, back and forth. He is all over the place, but his friend Jonathan is consistent and he is always there. And the reverse is also true, that we ourselves need good friends. We ourselves need encouragers and people to build us up and help us, because we are tossed to and fro. We are picked up and we are cast down. And so looking at this picture, verses 1-5, it's important to recognize the value of friendship. The value of friendship. Let's talk about Saul. Verses 2-30. We're just going to go through kind of verse by verse. If we remember what's happening here, I'll try to explain it as we go. So Saul is introduced to David. David just comes back from killing Goliath, and it says in verse 2, and Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. What is that? Conscription. David is not allowed to leave. By whose authority? The king's authority. Saul liked what he saw, and he took him, and he took advantage of him. Right? This is the peak of his prowess, the peak of his pride. And then we go on in verse 5. It says, "And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, and that was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants." This is Saul exalting David. And this is fascinating because what's going to happen here is Saul is going to hate that David is being exalted. And his response in hating David so much is to exalt him even more. So it says that he puts him over all the men of war, and everybody agrees with this. But Saul hates it. He is so proud and arrogant, he is so short-sighted that he is going to make decisions that makes himself more angry. Verse 8, it says that all the women were singing. Saul struck down his thousands, and repeat after me, David his 10,000s. David is exalted. The women are singing. This is a top 10, number 1 on the billboard. David is the best. Saul is second best. So verse 8, Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And he says, "They gave to David 10,000, but to me only thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom?" So this is his insecurity. This is the thing about pride, is it really is insecure. David, in his humility, is very secure. He has no problem with what's going to take place to him. But Saul has problems every step of the way. He gets frustrated. He gets angry. He gets jealous. And so he says, David is going to take the kingdom, right? How soon did this happen? The next day. This happened in one day. This dude is bipolar. He is excited. He's cowering in his tent. This young man shows up. He defeats the greatest enemy that the Israelites can find at the moment. And he comes back in, and everything's so great. Saul's excited. He's like, "You, sir, are not allowed to leave. You are now a slave under the throne. Let's get to work." And the very next day, "I hate David. I hate David." Verse 9, "And Saul eyed David from that day on." What do you think that word for eyed means? There's a sense of suspicion. Like, who is this guy? He's only here to be a problem. So he's reading evil intentions into David. David has given him no indication that he is unfaithful, unwilling, and usurping. He gives him no indication that he wants the throne. But he is reading evil intentions into his enemy. He sees him, he's jealous of him, and now he's creating a dialogue that makes him think that David's up to something. So he's suspicious and he's eyeing him out. Verse 10, "The next day a harmful spirit came from God, rushed upon Saul, and he raved within the house." And what does he try to do? He tries to stab him with a spear and stick him to the wall. Now he has murderous intent. It went from anger to jealousy to evil thinking about somebody else to full-blown evil, malicious, murderous intent. David gets away and he evades. So verse 12, there's a problem. Saul was afraid because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and he came in before the people. This is bad leadership. Real leadership is trying to make the best pieces fit, devoid of your emotions. So let's say Sean and I work together and I'm Sean's boss. Now, I don't really like Sean as a person. As a person, he hates God. As a person, he is not very kind to women. I have a lot of problems with Sean. But Sean is very good at his job. So you know what I do? I fire him because I don't like him as a person. No, that's bad leadership. Good leadership says, Sean might have some personal problems, but he can fill this role really well, and he can make our team better. So I will put him in a position that makes all of us successful. That is not how Saul operates. Saul says, I can't stand David. I try to kill him. He won't let me. So I'm mad and I'm angry. So what am I going to do? I'm going to promote him. I'm going to make him a ruler of thousands. I'm going to exalt him in the military. Now, what is David famous for? Being a musician, killing thousands of Philistines. What was it? He is famous for Goliath. He's famous for his military prowess. So what is Saul afraid of? That he's going to usurp him. So imagine being the president of the United States. You know who the president of the United States is? He's the commander-in-chief of our military. That's his role. That's his position. He is the head of the military. You know who the king is? He's the head of the military. So what do you do when you have an enemy who you think is trying to take your job? Promote him in the position that you do. That's reasonable. That's smart. Saul, in his suspicion, makes a very kind of stupid move, and in his emotional state, elevates David even higher. He promotes him even higher. And then we get into verse 15. After all of that, David is resoundingly successful. And when Saul saw that he had great success, or he was very wise, he stood in fearful awe of him. He's like, dang it, everything I do with this guy, he is successful. He's good. I hate him. Saul only makes it worse. And that's the interesting thing about pride. When we get into Romans chapter 1, it says that people in their pride did not give thanks to God and became foolish. They didn't glorify God as the creator, so he gave them up to a debased mind. They suppressed the truth. They can't see the truth. They can't acknowledge the truth. Their hearts are so hard that they create a reality that is not real, and they function and create more problems for themselves. Saul is a walking catastrophe, and all he does is make life harder for David, but more exaltation for David, more renown, more praise, and more success for David. So as Saul is dropping further and further down, David is rising higher and higher. And David has nothing to do with this. It's circumstantial. It's just happening to him. He's literally on the boat, riding the waves, and that's it. Okay, verse 17 through 19. Next slide. Now Saul said to David, "Here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." And then in verse 19 it says, "But at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should be given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Mehethalathite, for a wife." So what happened? So Saul says, "You can marry my daughter." Why did he say that? A wife. What kind of wife? His daughter. The promise was, if somebody can stand up to Goliath and defeat him, you'd be freed from taxes, your whole family, you'd be given wealth, and you'd be given a wife. You'd be son-in-law to the king. That was the promise. And David made sure of this. He went around talking to everybody, and everybody kept telling him this. He just kept jabbing on. You remember that when he was networking? And it got all the way back to Saul, and Saul dragged him in and sent him back out to fight Goliath. The expectation was that when David killed Goliath, he would marry his daughter. That was the trophy. That was the promise. That was the reward for defending and standing up for Israel, for being a valiant warrior. So here he says, "Here's my eldest daughter. I'll give her to you. But," right, here's the caveat. "I know you already won her. I know you've already been valiant. I need you to keep fighting for me. I need you to keep fighting for me, and I'll give you my daughter." Why? Why does he say fight for me? Because he wants to use the Philistines to kill David. He is such a coward that he went from trying to kill David himself to now trying to get somebody else to kill him. not by his own hand. He was scapegoating. And on top of that, he's using a good thing, that is marriage, to try to ensnare him. And he doesn't just say, you've earned this reward. He says, you have to pay for it again. David is paying for the wife, first in killing Goliath, second in continuously serving in the military. And then what does Saul do? He gives his daughter away to somebody else. He gives her away to somebody, like, really? You already promised her to him twice, and then you shipped her off to somebody else. And we'll talk about David's response when we get there. Then we go in a step further. He uses Merab. That doesn't work out. So then he says in verse 20, Saul's daughter Michal loved David. And Saul was like, oh, I can still make this work. I will give him my other daughter, the younger daughter, and she loves him, so it's okay, not a big deal. Now he says this, verse 21, Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Now we're still talking about the Philistines. He still has to pay for her by being in the military. But what does he say about his daughter? Why would he give him this daughter? There's something flawed about her. He says, I will give her to him that she may be a trap. She may be a trap for him. Now, he already knows she loves him. So how could she be a trap? She must be a bad woman. She must be a bad daughter. This isn't the first choice, and this isn't the most desirable choice. He picks her so that she would be a problem for him. That says a lot about the character of Michal. Later on, David is going to be so excited about God that he's going to be dancing in the streets. And she is going to get upset and deride him and call him out for being foolish. And he says, if this is foolishness, I will continue to be a fool. She actually resists him in trying to pursue the things of God. So she is almost, in that instance, a half-hearted believer and or just a full-blown kind of hypocrite, like a false Israelite. That is why Saul gives it to her. He is using a good thing for evil. He is using marriage for evil. First, he was using the Philistines. Now he is using marriage, which is his daughter, and he's manipulating that situation to be a snare for his enemy. Verses 28 through 29, David's going to be successful and he's going to marry her. But 28 and 29 is very telling. It says, when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continuously. So this is what this says. Saul had eyes to see, but could not see. Saul had ears to hear, but could not hear. He knew God's plan. He saw the love that everybody had for David, that David was a genuinely good person, but the evil in Saul's heart made him bitter, envious, and full of hatred. And so now he is more afraid of David, and he is committed to being his enemy consistently or forever. It's interesting to see that somebody who once walked with God, somebody who once wanted to do God's will, now sees God's will, acknowledges God's will in somebody else's life, and hates it. They can't stand it. Saul is fully darkened, fully debased, fully abandoned by God. He is absolutely cast off and cast aside. And the result of that is that he would look at God's work and hate it. He can see it clearly. And he says, this is God's good and acceptable will, and I can't stand it. It is shocking to see that. And that's what this fear is like. This fear that Saul has for David is shocking. It's bizarre. It's strange. It is so big and outlandish because it shouldn't exist. It's an unnatural thing. It is against God's will that he should hate David this much. It's an evil thing. It's a heart of debauchery and insanity. He sees it and he hates it. Saul only gets worse. He just continues to dive headfirst. You ever see like little pools with like 3 feet of water? Do you guys swim a lot? Do you know how to dive? Do you dive in 3 feet of water? Never. You don't want to touch the bottom. Saul is diving into like 6 inches of water. It's just nonsense. He is running straight into God's fist. God just puts his hand up and he says, stop. And Saul is going to run into that hand repetitively over and over and over again. And eventually, he's just going to die. He's actually going to commit suicide. That's the epitome of Saul. We don't want to be Saul. Saul starts really well and ends so tragically, even turning on God's people and turning on God himself. Let's talk about David. Let's start all over again. Go to chapter 18, verse 2. We're going to talk about David's character while he rises through the ranks. What we're going to find is that he suffers. He suffers, and he suffers long. And he is patient, he is kind, he is forgiving, and he trusts in the Lord. He trusts in the process. He knows that God is working these things for good. So let's watch as he suffers, what he's going to suffer, what he's going to lose, and how he responds. Slide. Verse 2, we talked about Jonathan being conscripted. Now, he is forced to join the military, and he is not allowed to go where? Which means he's not allowed to see who? Family. His dad. He maybe sees his brothers because they're in the military. But he, from day one, starts off by losing everything. Those sheep that he used to tend to, those servants that he was friends with, his family, his father, his brothers, he doesn't get to spend time with them anymore. He's in the military, he's a commander, and he's out doing battle. He's coming in and he's going out. And he is forced to serve. Remember that. He is a slave. Ultimately, he is a slave. And that was what the promise was that Samuel told him. Samuel told him, if you have a king, he will enslave you. He will enslave your young men, and he will march them out, and he will make them his servants. And that's exactly what happened to David. Verse 3 through 5, he is given the blessing of having a wonderful friend. And not only does he accept it, but he accepts the thing. This was a hard one for me to swallow. Pride can present itself in a lot of different ways. Some of it is being self-sufficient and not allowing people to help you. And other times it's not allowing people to bless you. When you're proud, you won't let people do good things for you because it's humbling in an odd sense. So David is willing and accepting Jonathan's love, Jonathan's affection, and Jonathan's belongings. There's no indication that he says, no, I can't, oh, it's yours, no. It just simply says, this is what Jonathan did, and now it's David's. He just received it with gratefulness. In verse 10, we get all the way to the singing of the song and Saul eyeing David. And then verse 10, it says, the next day a harmful spirit came from God. David went through the rush of notoriety and fame. He went from being a nobody to being the person who slays Goliath, the person who slays 10,000 people. Women are singing about him, and everybody's dancing and clapping and singing, and they're excited for this young man. But he is unaffected because the very next day, Saul is losing his stuff, but David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. David lived a normal life even during fame and success. He was unaffected by it. And this is very important. This is actually what Billy Graham did. He would preach and everybody, like lots of people coming to the Lord, very famous. Everybody knew him, but he was, by all accounts from people that I've heard, very humble in the fact that he never praised himself. He never exalted himself. He just walked around as a normal person, living a normal life the next day. And what this does is it keeps us from getting overly depressed. When you have very high seasons, that's typically when you're going to have a very low season. You get this high of serotonin, and then when you don't have that high of serotonin, you drop back down into the valley and you feel depressed and you're just looking for that high again. And so the best thing to do is to not over rejoice and over indulge in that successful season, but to curb it at the top and not allow it to get to you, and your serotonin won't peak and it also won't drop and you can mellow out. And that's what David did. He rode the wave, being a normal person, standing unaffected by these things. And then in verse 11, it says, Saul hurled the spear at him and tried to kill him. How many times? Do you think David was ready for the second one? Yep. If I pulled out a gun and tried to shoot you right now, what is your response? Leave. I'm not hanging out. That dude's crazy. What is David's response? It's all right, man. You're good. I'll just get back to playing. David doesn't just flee. He sat there and dealt with the situation. Obviously, he didn't get stabbed. He was evasive, but he was willing to endure it twice. Saul tried it the first time. That's where you say, hey, shame on you. And when he tried it the second time, you're like, oh, shame on me, right? No, David is patient and willing to suffer wrong. That's a big one. People don't like that. To find yourself to be a victim. I had to have this conversation with my coworker one time. He's somewhat of a Christian. He's sort of Mormon, but he's more Christian than he is Mormon. We at work were being wronged as a crew, as individuals. We were suffering at the hands of other people at work. And this guy started to lose his cool. He's an angry person, but he keeps his calm really well. But his anger started to tick. And I literally had to tell him it's okay to be a victim. And he lost it. And he's like, I'm not a victim mentality, yada, yada, yada. And like, no. It's not accepting that you're a victim and you're being held down. It's the fact that other people are going to mistreat you, and that's okay. It's going to happen. You have to be willing to be wronged. You know why? Because that's how you keep your heart open to other people. If you're not willing to be hurt, you're not willing to love them. Because to love somebody means they have the potential to hurt you. David loves Saul. David, through this journey, refuses to hurt him, refuses to dishonor him, refuses to turn on him because of his love for the Lord that makes him love him. So being willing to be wronged is difficult, but David was capable of doing it. Verses 13 through 16, we get Saul exalting him and putting him over the rulers and the kings, and he went out and became very successful. David is willing to accept orders, and he serves diligently. Here is Saul out to get him, eyeing him, trying to pierce him to a wall, and then sending him out into battle. David's not stupid. He knows that he's being placed in the front lines to be killed. This is actually going to be, in my mind, not biblical, my own opinion. I believe this is where David learns that if you want to get rid of somebody, put them in the front lines. Because that's what he does with Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. When they commit adultery, he says, hey, why don't you go in the front lines? Back to the soldiers. Yeah, and then withdraw, and then he gets killed. But David is placed in a peculiar situation, and he is successful because he serves with diligence and because the Lord is with him. And that's notable. Everybody recognizes it. Verse 16, but all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. He was a servant, and everybody saw it. He didn't complain. He didn't freak out. He just took command of his army. He took command of the men under him, and he went out and he got the job done as a servant. And he served his king and he served his nation. Verse 17, this is the battle of the first wife. What does David lose with his first wife? He loses her. He lost his trophy, the promised reward for doing his job. Now, let me put this in comparison. You guys have been working all year long on a project. This project has literally made you pull your hair out. You get to the end of it, and the promise the whole time was either a promotion, a raise, or a bonus. Something. And you know what you get? Nothing. You just get another promise. No. Here's this one. Well, that didn't work out. Sorry. We'll get you on the next one. Now, this is a tough pill to swallow because I'm there. I've been there. I know this feeling. When you get played by other people, when they promise you things and they don't do it, you get played. And David, he got played. That is a tough pill to swallow. But he comes in for round 2. Verse 20, he comes back for round 2, and Saul tells him that on second thought, I'll give you my other daughter. But all you have to do, and he changes the terms, all you have to do is go kill 100 people. That's not fair. That's not just. That's not righteous. Like, you've screwed me twice. And the third time, you're going to add requirements for me to do this thing? To get the thing that I already worked for twice? But David is humble. David doesn't say a word. In fact, it's the opposite. He actually gets very excited. In verse 18, it says, David said to Saul, who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to the king? Who am I that I should be a part of your family, a part of the kingdom? Now that is true humility, because there is nobody like David in the kingdom. Everybody knows him. Everybody has seen him. Everybody loves him. He is the most notable person in the kingdom, but he himself does not feel that way about himself. He doesn't perceive himself to be what everybody else makes him out to be. He is humble in his own eyes, and that is why God is going to exalt him. But he humbly forgives and forgets. This is a tough one. He forgives and he forgets. It's as if Merib never even existed. It's as if none of that first marriage ever took place. The promise, the service, everything. It's as if he just skips over that in his own mind and his own heart so that he can honor the king. And he says it again here, verse 26. So the servants came back to David and said that you have to kill 100 dudes. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law before the time had expired. So David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. He didn't just kill one, he killed 200 of the Philistines. It pleased him that he should be the king's son-in-law. What's interesting is David never stops fighting. He never stops working for his position, even after he's earned it twice. The third time, he finally gets his reward, and he is glad, and he is excited, and he is pleased with the opportunity. Now, this is true humility of rags to riches, because David has always been at the bottom. And when given the opportunity to work, he worked. When he missed the reward, he continued to work. When he missed the reward again, he continued to work. That is the fighting spirit, and that only comes in recognizing that you got nothing coming. David did not believe that he had earned anything, that he was valued in any way. He knew he needed to keep putting in and putting up and slam dunking it, because no one was ever going to help him. He had to keep fighting even after he had done more than anybody else. And that's what's going to lead to his success. He is a fighter. In verse 30, it says that the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. The only way that his name was highly esteemed is because he kept putting in the effort. Daily discipline, his character shining forth and people recognizing it. But here's what's interesting. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5, it says this: when a man marries a wife, he is to stay home with her for 1 year and not go out to war. What does that mean? It's a vacation. It's a honeymoon. You, oh Mr. Warrior, are commanded by God to stay home with your wife. So he marries into the royal family. He marries Michal. And what's his response? Back to work. He gave up his privilege. He gave up his opportunity to stay home, to save his life, and he went out and he fought instead. So that's David versus Saul, humility versus pride. What do you guys think? What's some good applications here? How does this apply to your life? Be at peace with your enemies. Romans chapter 12, 9 through 21 is really good. It says, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil. There's some other really good stuff in there. Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. And then it talks about your enemies, that don't return evil for evil, but on the contrary, bless. Heap burning coals upon their heads. Don't avenge yourself. And as long as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. As long as you have a choice, which you do, you always have a choice, live at peace. And that's what David did. David was always living at peace with Saul. Now, did he have peace with Saul? Not at all. Not even close. But whose fault was that? Saul's fault. David did everything in his power, everything that he could to honor him, to respect him, and to never slight him or give him cause for alarm. And then we have be a best friend. Now, here's what's important. You're going to have few friends. It's a fact. I have very few friends. But I will say this. I am a friend to everybody. Everybody needs a friend, and I can be a friend to everybody. But that doesn't mean everybody will be my friend. It's the willingness to look out for other people above yourself. It's the willingness to honor others more than you honor yourself. It is a willingness to care about those who don't care about you. You can always be a friend, but that doesn't mean you will always have a friend. So be a best friend to somebody. And then be a servant. Jesus says in Matthew 20, 27 through 28, that if you would be great in the kingdom of God, you would be a slave and that you would serve all. And then he says this, I did not, right? He says the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. We are servants. David is that wonderful picture of Jesus, that as soon as he steps on the scene and is exalted above every other name, right? David's name is renowned above all other names. He is the greatest servant. He serves his nation, he serves his king, he serves his family, and he serves his people. And then there is be filled with the Spirit. David's success, every time it's mentioned here, it's because the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. God was leading David. It says that David would go out and he was very wise in his actions, or he was very successful in his actions. And it says, because the Lord was with him. Saul could see that the Lord was with him. If Saul, who is so blind, can see that the Lord is with him, how much more so can the people who are willing to follow God? So the question is, are we filled with the Spirit? Are we being successful so that God can be glorified? Are we being wise in our generation, in our world, so that God can receive the glory? That we can say, it is not me, but it is Christ in me. It is not me, but it is the Spirit of God in me, making me successful, making me who I am. By God's grace, I am who I am.